Welcome to A Fresh Take, Culture and Comics. I'm your host, Dan Friedman. Thanks for joining us. Just a few quick housekeeping things, and then we'll get into the show. We will be back with our regular show on Thursday, and we'll be doing a sort of non comic book centric show. We'll be talking about current state of television, so looking back on some recent favorites, looking ahead to some shows we are anticipating. If you love your TV, and don't we all these days, please join us. Then we are going to take about a week break from shows, and then on Valentine's Day, we will return and get to our regular Monday and Thursday schedules moving forward. I'm hoping that Thursday I'll be able to announce some big, exciting guests that we're trying to finalize, but we've got some really great stuff coming up. However, I do want this channel to be a community driven channel. So if there's topics you want to see us hit, if there's things you want to know more about, please leave us a comment. We'll get back to you. We really love interacting and help us shape the experience that you want to see. I will say that there's a couple different people that reached out about if you're a gamer. There's been a lot of large video game company mergers with major media platforms. So I think we are working on putting something together with that. We're going to have some discussion about Yellow Jackets, which I've just adored, and a lot of people want to talk about Station 11. We'll hit those. If you are a reader of the Stormlight Archive, Brandon Sanderson's fantasy epic, we got a real special one. It's going to be a little while out still, but we're going to dive deep on that, and some of the guests that are coming together that are great. We got a board game show coming up. We're going to talk a little about demystifying Web3 and NFTs. In just a moment, we are going to be joined by our guest and get into breaking down the best and maybe not so best of the Marvel, Netflix, and MCU villains. But before we do that, I did want to address something more serious. So, in general, with this channel, I want to bring up things that are fun, things that connect us. But I don't want to ignore things that are happening in the world, particularly in the areas of comic books, pop culture, our culture in general. And I want to talk a little bit about a story you may have heard of last week, that McMinn County in Tennessee, their Board of Ed, voted 10-0 to ban Art Spiegelman's Mouse. Now, just a little bit about Mouse before I talk about the story that's going on. If you aren't familiar, Mouse is the illustrated true story of Spiegelman's father and his experiences during World War II, as told by the son. It portrays the Jewish people as mice and the Germans as cats, and it uses that format to tell its story. It was in 1992. It became the first graphic novel ever to win the Pulitzer Prize, and really opened the floodgates for graphic novels and comic books to be seen as literature and not just this fringe thing for kids or for people who weren't taking their adulthood seriously. Much in the way that if you look at sort of Tolkien's place in fantasy epics and how The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings really allowed fantasy writing to be accepted as literature. So all by itself, it has an important place in sort of the history of literature. Additionally, you can imagine that it is a seminal work in educating and sharing the emotional and, traumatic stories related to the Holocaust and his personal experience. Now, there's good news before I get into the bad. So the good news is, because of them banning this, it has brought tremendous attention back to Mao's. And actually, I think as last I checked, there were 3 different volumes of it that were currently in like the Amazon top 10. It's probably selling way more than it had before. So in that respect, that's a positive. But when you read, and you can go look this up, when you read about the Board of Ed's statement, why they unanimously voted 10-0 to ban it, the examples they gave were some crude language, certainly some depictions of violence, traumatic violence, and of nudity. So I'm going to hit a couple of them in a minute, but I want to talk about the nudity because it's the part that really made me start thinking in a different way about this. So the nudity in the book is a panel in which Spiegelman, the artist's mom, has his breast is exposed as she kills herself in a bathtub. That's what we're talking about when they're talking about the depiction of nudity. And I understand why that's uncomfortable. But that's kind of the point, right? So these pieces exist to give the context to the history. And if you remove that, you're removing the trauma, the generational trauma, and that is uncomfortable. But it also denies what happened. And I was thinking about this a lot in the relationship to the conversation in this country about critical race theory and the way that's trying to be pushed out all over the country from our classrooms. And while these are not the same thing, they are rooted in a similar idea. Again, a discomfort with our histories. And that discomfort is not the discomfort of the Jewish people dealing with the Holocaust. It's not the discomfort of people of color in America dealing with the racial history of America, right? Those are not the people feeling that discomfort. So maybe we need to look at why people are pushing away that discomfort and realize that when you take that away and you deny the trauma, the deep generational trauma that comes from the racial history of this country, that comes from the Holocaust and genocides throughout the world, you're whitewashing our history. You're denying the context that informs us how to make better decisions now and in the future to live better with each other, to do better, right? We learn through discomfort. So if something's discomforting, the move isn't to ban it. The move is to embrace it and learn from it and recognize it. And that's really all I want to say on that. I'm sorry to start on such a serious note. I promise we're about to do something so much more fun. But it's important we have honest conversations about this stuff. And when it's this present in the news, I'm going to talk about it. So I hope you join me for that. And I hope I didn't bum anybody out. And let's have some fun. So with that, I'd like to welcome our guest. Let's bring in Ed Bowser from soulinstereo.com, his blog. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. And thank you for what you just said. I mean, I know 8-9 minutes. We came here for the comics, but I mean, quite honestly, we're just here for the real. And real quick, before we jump in, I just wanted to co-sign something you said. And there are two things that really hit me about Moss and this whole narrative that we're having. I love that. First of all, I'm a son of a librarian. I love writing, I love reading, and I love storytelling, and that's shaped everything I've done. And the reason why I've always gravitated to the stories of comics is that it takes real life experiences, makes it a little bit of fantasy, but if you look, is rooted in real life. These are real stories, real relationships, and those what always drove me to these stories. That comic is so important because it takes a fantasy type setting, but it's a real world issue that happened and that is presented in a way that could be more palatable or reach some folks in a different type of way, but it's a story that needs to be told. And it's so frustrating for a person of color to see these types of stories being suppressed because it comes from a place of privilege. I don't have the privilege to say, oh, this is uncomfortable, because the history of our country has made lots of uncomfortable things for my community. So what we have to do is continue to tell those stories through any medium. To shut that down is to deny history that has been part of this country. So I'm absolutely against it. And thank you for what you said.
Yeah, no problem. And I also want to add, graphic novels and comics have been proven time and time again to be very effective educational tools. So it's really not the educational value of these things as well. It's really a denial of that. So anyway, on to more fun things. Yeah.
Yes. I can go all day on this, but we'll do that another time.
Well, maybe we'll make another episode where we focus
Yes.
a little bit, dive deeper on that. So, first of all, you took on the task of ranking every Marvel villain, Marvel cinematic villain from the MCU, and you also included the Netflix villains.
Indeed.
You didn't do like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and things like that, right? You stuck to Netflix and MCU, correct?
That is correct. This task was Herculean, and even though I love Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the other shows, I was like, I just can't. I can't. There'll be too much. But
so yeah, go ahead.
But it was cool. It was fun. Took a long time, but I had a great time. I didn't get Grant Ward in it. Sorry, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. fans. That dude popped up 800 times.
I bet. So, I think it was 60 in total, right? It was 1 through 60 or 1 through 59, something.
Yeah, like it was over 60, I think. Yes.
Yeah. So, can you tell me, before we'll get into the rankings and talk about where people landed and things like that, but can you talk to me about, process, like how did you decide how you're approaching it? How did you weigh certain factors if people showed up in different mediums?
Right.
Talk to me a little bit how you approached it.
So I went through, and a lot of these lists have been made in the past, but I couldn't find one that was just everybody. And I was like, okay, that's a cool take to kind of have on this. So I went through, of course, had my own knowledge, looked at like 15 other lists to make sure that like I wasn't missing anyone. And I created this gigantic master list because I'm old school, wrote it in pencil, had it down on my pad. And then I weighted basically by a few factors. So number one, I took out anyone who was just kind of like a grunt or like henchman type dude, Crossbones, the Shocker, people who were only in it that were for comic fans to be like, oh, I know who that guy is.
Right. Little Easter eggs and gifts and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yes, I kind of removed that crew, and that took maybe 15 people off the table. But from those that remain, what I did was look at it from exactly how, number one, how effective they were as a villain, how compelling their story is, and this is how cool they are. So this just is in a list of like my favorite villains, because I think my favorite was like in the teens or something. Had to be unbiased with the list, so I didn't have it like that. But I was like, who had the best story arc? Who was the most effective? And that's why a lot of times you'll see some of the more Netflix villains high on the list, because they had more time to flesh out their stories.
I did notice that, and I also wonder if that has something to do with the range of subject matter the Netflix shows could do that the MCU shows haven't up until this point. I think maybe that, but we can get into that.
Yeah.
So I think that your top, spoiler alert, we're going to start at the top four.
Okay.
I think that your top four are undeniably the top four, and we'll mention who they are. I think you can argue, how you're moving around that top four.
Of course.
But you had Thanos, I'll get the order wrong, but Thanos, Killmonger, Kilgare, Purple Man, and Kingpin. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Would you agree with that statement, that feels like a Mount Rushmore, or do you think that extends past that group of four?
I think if you have a Mount Rushmore of MCU right now, that's it. Like, I can't think of anyone else. You could make a case for one or two people that may have been later in the top 10, but for effectiveness and profile, and I mean, Loki is the one that you could maybe get in there, especially if you haven't seen the Netflix shows. But he's so ambiguous with his, where he stands. I think that is kind of weird. So those are my four if we're doing an evil Mount Rushmore.
Now, so we're going to put a pin on Loki, because that actually is an exact topic I want to get to a little bit later, of how you decided whether he qualified or not. So did you, when looking at, let's say, like Purple Man, we haven't seen return, did you factor in Kingbin's return in the Hawkeye series, and how'd you weigh that versus the entirety of his arc in the Daredevil show?
I think when this was created, he hadn't yet debuted. It was
Oh,
like
okay.
rumors that he was going to show up, and it was like, oh, we might, and maybe he was even lurking in around. And we saw the hand or whatever was going on in the Hawkeye show. But no, his ranking is based solely on his feud with Daredevil.
Got it. Okay, so let's pivot to Loki here. So you have him at 5.
Yep.
And I mean, I've nothing to argue with from the sake of the quality of that performance, the actor in the role,
absolutely,
the arc of Loki, which is one of the more interesting arcs of any character I think we've seen portrayed in the MCU. Was it cut and dry that you felt comfortable making him a villain on this list? Did it affect his ranking based on kind of everything we've experienced with them?
I think he had to be there. If he wasn't there, people would be like, oh my God, Loki. Because the first half of, well, I'm saying the first half, maybe the first fourth of the MCU phase 1 and 2, like he was the preeminent bad guy. So you can't really erase that, even though he has had like this turn and he's gone back and forth through most of the movies. He's kind of solid now as kind of a hero, if we've seen an Endgame, and then going into his own solo series. So he's kind of firmly on the side of good right now, but you had to just take in pretty much the entirety of his early run. And he was the preeminent bad guy for that. He was the Thanos stand-in almost until we got into that later phase. So, yep, most of all of that was kind of factored into that. And to your point, like he was just such a compelling character, switching sides, had to include that.
Gotcha. Let's before we move out of the very top of the list, I do want to talk about Kilgare the Purple Man, who I just think was a terrifying portrayal.
Absolutely.
A super creepy character that maybe not as many people know. Probably Jessica Jones wasn't as heavily watched as some of the other properties. Talk to me a little bit about that character and what brought him so high up the list. I think you have him, is it 3?
I think he was 3. Yeah, he was 3.
Yes.
If you haven't seen, anyone watching this, if you haven't seen Jessica Jones season 1, stop. I was going to say, stop what you're doing. Wait till this is over. Then whatever you have planned for the evening, get rid of it. Because to me, this was Jessica Jones season 1, to me, was the best thing that Netflix MCU put out until I think I ended up putting Daredevil season 3 as number 1 eventually. But this was my number 1.
So good.
Oh my goodness. But that was my number 1. And the reason why is, as you mentioned, he's so real. His realness isn't some space dude from Titan or whatever, or some devil lady. Like, this is a real dude who is manipulating a woman. And these the themes that he was using is stuff that so many people can relate to. And I love the story because Jessica's overcoming her trauma and facing it is so relatable. And he's such the perfect scumbag. So
and just absolutely, a fantastic actor.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So let's get to Luke Cage. One of the things I thought was so interesting, and I think it's very much reflected on the widespread of your rankings, is how many villains that series had.
Yes.
That had a pretty wide variety of both success and development. We can talk about some specific ones, but just can you talk to me, like, just broadly about that show delivering so many different characters at such varying degrees of success, and kind of what you thought of that experience?
First of all, I have to give props. I love that show. I loved how they incorporated hip hop, which is so huge in my life. I mean, they made the actual city a character almost. I love that they were able to place it. But you had Luke Cage, this kind of guy who wanted to be a hero, that, he was kind of coping with this and trying to understand it, thrust into this crime world. And I love that each villain that was there, with the exception of one that I'm sure we'll get to later, and I'll be nice. Like, almost every villain had a great backstory and they had great motivations for what they were doing, which is one that wasn't paid off very well. But I love that everyone had their own take. So you had the Mariah Stokes and the Dillards and the Bushmaster who was coming into that conflict. And I didn't even put in like Nightshade. She was one of the ones I kind of put off to the side. You had her thing.
I remember.
Cottonmouth, dumb old Diamondback. There were just so many people inserted around in this world. But again, it felt really grounded. I mean, and that's real life. It's not just one crime dude running all of crime in a city. You got these different factors, these different folks that play with their own agendas. Here's poor Luke Cage kind of thrust in the middle, and he's trying to navigate his own life, these powers he didn't ask for, and also trying to make his city a better place. I love how each of those players were manipulating my man Shades off in the corner, always doing something weird and creepy. Great.
I thought he was a really good character. Yeah,
I love Shades. So I wish we got a little bit more of him. But
yeah,
when it comes down to it, it was just this guy thrust into this world filled with very bad dudes, each with their own motivations and really goals and desires. And this one poor guy's got to make it all right. And then I hate that it ended because it seemed like Luke was going down the dark path. I wanted to see him become what he was fighting against and having to pull away from it. Oh, didn't get it.
You know, I was thinking about this, and other than the Iron Fist show, and we'll maybe briefly touch Iron Fist later, but maybe it's not even worth it. But you know, we talked about Kilgare, we talked about Luke Cage. Now, obviously, Kingpin and Gao, who I think was a fantastic villain.
Yes,
as
shout
well.
out to Madame
Gao. Really, just so well. Yeah. Anyway, that so many villains from the Netflix show are so high on this list, and I remember, you know, I always gravitated to Marvel over DC, and when people ask why, it took me a while to figure it out, and then I was thinking about something Stan Lee said a number of times in an interview, and he said his main directive always was have the comics reflect the world that the heroes are in, right? So it wasn't Gotham and Metropolis, it was New York City. You know, it wasn't, you know, it was in the 60s, it was upheaval on campuses and in city streets. They dealt with that subject matter. You know, paying rent was an issue. You know, they really grounded it in reality. Now, superheroes, okay, so there's fantasy, right? But that was always a premium, and I do think that is the rich texture that helped build Marvel into what it was. And I wonder if Netflix having the wider sort of ability with content and sort of not just the language and the violence, but just like a broader palette in which they could present a, like you were saying, a realer portrayal of these cities and these stories, gave runway for a better crop of villains. Do you think that that tracks?
I do, because again, when you were the direction of those Netflix series, like it was very rooted in reality, and all of that stuff just played so well. And going back to your, you know, your fandom of Marvel, it's funny because I was a DC guy. I know, but
I don't hate on DC. I just was I gravitated to Marvel.
I love DC, and the thing that I love most about Marvel was the X-Men, and I love them for the reasons that you said. You felt their struggles, you understood the prejudices and things that they were fighting against. It makes everything so much more relatable, and that's why those villains on Marvel's Netflix work so well. These are people, almost everybody, with a couple of exceptions, or people that you could probably run into in real life. You definitely wouldn't want to, but there's a different connection that you have when there's folks that feel more real than, you know, some rock-faced guy on a planet full of lava. So, like, you're not going to see him anywhere, or his creepy grandma. Like, that's just its only thing.
Our producers entered the conversation. What's up?
Allie and I have just been recently watching Daredevil season 1 again. And there's something that the Netflix shows could do that I also feel it feels a little bit more grounded in reality than some of the MCU stuff. It's kind of the darkness that is told in some of these shows. Like Kingpin in season 1 of Daredevil is so scary that he causes a guy to impale his face into like the side of a building. And that, you know, that's one thing that makes those villains incredibly scarier to me as well because of
Yeah.
that like realness to the violence.
But here's that
Netflix
next
brings to
level
it.
to that though. Like, not only was he scary, he was like, there were lots of time I felt bad for Kingpin when the part where he's like staring at the wall and then he buys a painting that looks like the wall. He's got a closet full of suits, it's the same suit. Like, he's a very sad and broken person. And again, even though he's terrifying, you understand where he came from, and those series were able to build upon that more, as opposed to, you know, those weirdos they had in the Eternals. It's like, okay, here's the freaking walking Digimon. Like, oh, we're scared. Like, they're able to build so much more through that grounded and those 13 episodes that they had to play with.
So let's pivot to some of the MCU stuff now. So one character, and I'm the further this goes, the more I think I'm in the minority here. But somebody you had fairly high up that I really saw as a disappointment, from at least from the comic reader standpoint, and I thought the execution was Agatha Harkness. Now, you had Agatha Harkness at 9. Catherine Hahn is an incredible actress. So this is not a shot at her per se, and maybe I was just looking for too high of a bar for her. But there was sort of the over the top comical cackle witch ending of her really undid the whole magic for me. Tell me why did you have her ranked so high? What worked for you? And she's now going to get her own show, I believe. So clearly, a lot of people felt it was successful.
Man, all it takes is a hot song and good, and you're on the top of the world. But
all along,
I loved Agatha's portrayal because, like, from jump, you knew everybody had those weird takes and like, oh my God, it's Mephisto because I saw a fly on the wall. And
it wasn't.
Everything is Mephisto. Oh my God,
right.
I'm sure he's coming. Everybody,
I'm sure
down.
he is. He's
coming
in the horror books, but yeah.
But I love her take because, again, when we got her backstory and we understand what she was doing, she was almost a little sympathetic. Yeah, she was over the top, and she's not much like her comic depiction. And I'm careful in this list, just to make this point, to not weigh people against their comic depictions, because as comic readers, we do that. That's why I have beef with Ultron, but we'll get to him later.
We're gonna hit Ultron for sure.
Oh my gosh, he look a silver Michelin man. I hate how he looks. But anyway, I love her portrayal because, sort of like a lesser, more ridiculous Kingpin, you saw how she got to be where she was. She wanted to use this power for good. Actually, she's being selfish. She just wanted it. And you saw those different layers to her. And there was almost a part where she kind of wanted to help out Scarlet Witch a little bit.
That's what lost me. Not her wanting to help, but the flashback with her, the mom and the coven, and sort of giving the justification was rich backstory, right? And looked like they were giving her these layers, and then it literally descended into like comic witch cackle. And it really lost what I thought was actually, yes, you knew early on, and I was fine with that, especially how obviously highly stylized the show started, right? Yes. So that fit. And then you got to sort of closer to reality, and I thought she adapted that as well. And then it finished, almost like a caricature, and that's really where it fell apart for me. I'm curious to see which Agatha we get when she gets this series. Like,
I agree.
Not through the eyes. Oh God.
Well, the point I was going to mention, to your point, is I agree. I liked her up until, I guess, on the final episode, when she just turned to, like, in boss at Final Fantasy or whatever. Like, that's when I was kind of like, okay. I had issues with the end of WandaVision anyway, but because it kind of seemed like they hand waved off everything. But yeah, your point is sound, and I agree with that. But I don't think to me, it didn't take away from the great foundation that was built. I love that she had shades of gray. I love my villains with shades of gray. So I love that was there too. And she was just a compelling personality as well.
Yeah. I'm going to, a regular contributor here is Robert Kessler, who just made a good point. I'm throwing it up in the chat. We've talked about this before and as perspective, but like that his issue with Agatha as a villain is that Wanda was the villain of that story, essentially. And so she was really stopping Wanda from holding people hostage. It is a flawed piece. Even if she was doing that selfishly, for selfish reasons, that was effectively what she was trying to make happen.
True. And it's funny. I'm so glad that was brought up, because before I did this list, I polled my I have a Facebook group, the Soul and Stereo Cipher on Facebook. Trust me, it's the only place on Facebook that's not crazy. You can go hang out, we talk music, pop culture, all this stuff. And before I did the list, I actually did a poll. Do you think that Wanda is a villain? Because I wanted to know if I put her on this list. And you know, the internet, it's like you can't win for losing. So I thought really hard about making her a villain, and a lot of people made, you know, compelling arguments that she was the protagonist, maybe not necessarily the most honest. And to that point that was made, she kind of was the bad guy, and Agatha was fighting against it, even though she was selfish in her own right. That's why she leaned that way. So I understand kind of the conflicted takes.
All right, let's talk about some things we agree on were less successful. So it's one thing, I think, to swing and miss on, you know, some lesser baddies, you know, and it's another thing to like try to make something in Agatha where you're creatively going for something different, and maybe it has varying degrees of success. What I really don't think I'll ever forgive the MCU for is a portrayal of two iconic villains that they wasted.
Oh, I know where we're going. I'm ready.
One in a big way with Ultron, and the other one, Red Skull, one of the most terrifying faces of evil Marvel's ever created, and they tossed him aside. Talk to me about those two.
He was just some random dude. Now, again,
just a random dude.
I am going back through the MCU right now, and I actually watched Ultron last night, and I did not like this movie. But it's in age, you know, in time, I appreciate it a little bit better. Again, if you
it's been trashed so much that like we collectively have over trashed it.
Right, that's exactly what I was going to say, and. As a film on its own, just looking at MCU Ultron and not Ultron, one of my favorite characters ever, separating the two, he's fine. I don't like that he's goofy. I don't like that he has lips. I don't like that he's like, looks like he's on, I don't know, drinking muscle milk or whatever robots drink. Like, it's like, dude, but in that story itself, I'll give it a little bit of leeway. Red Skull, I have more beef with because, again, an iconic villain. If this was handled in phase 4, 5, 6, he would have been more awesome. But they really had a problem with villains development early on. I mean, for like the first, I'll say, 10 movies or so, they could not get it together because they were spending so much time developing the heroes. Not mad at that, but they didn't understand that having strong villains too just helps elevate the story. Everybody was just a guy they punched at the end of the movie, and that's what poor Red Skull was. I mean, we got him again in Endgame, which was a nice, you know, they threw us a bone there.
That's how I felt about that. It was almost like a we're sorry.
Yes, it's a make good.
Yeah.
But
it still wasn't being Red Skull then either.
No,
not caretaker. At all. It wasn't, you know. Yeah, it really is a bummer.
He's some weird Grim Reaper dude, like whatever.
Now,
but
do you think, because Red Skull, obviously this would be a lot harder to do. Do you think there are certainly, and this is always rumored, but there are certainly multiple ways that we could see Ultron again in the MCU? I mean, that's the sort of ongoing joke about Ultron in the comics itself is every time you think you're rid of Ultron, Ultron finds a way to pop back up, right? In fact, I'd be curious to see if they do Annihilation Conquest at some point, which is I'm going to do a whole episode on Annihilation for anyone that's read it, and if you haven't, one of the great Marvel crossover space epics. But so that as a little bit of a transition here brings me to a really fascinating character that felt very much like two different characters in two different projects. Let's talk Zemo.
Oh, yes.
Because Zemo is essentially a plot device, our first go around with him. And then really was like the darling charm of the Disney Plus Falcon and Winter Soldier.
Right.
So how did you weigh those two things when you were figuring out where he fell on the list? And remind me, do you remember roughly where he was on the list?
Was he top 10? He was like 10 or 11.
A little lower, I think. Yeah, 12 or something in that range. But he was high. He was fairly high up.
Yeah, he was pretty high. And I'll say this because he's another character that I really love. Goofy as they are, I love Masters of Evil. I love his look with the crown and the little fur things that he has on his shoulders. I love Zemo. So when we got him in Civil War, he was again just a dude who just, his name could be Joe Smith. They just happened.
You had him 10, by the way. Sorry, I just looked it up. You had him 10.
Okay. The reason why he was ranked high, and some people called me out and said he should be even higher, was because he was successful. And if you look at kind of the things that I used to weigh these villains, there are a few villains that actually won. Thanos is one. He's another that actually succeeded in what he was trying to do. Mm-hmm. So that's one reason why he got a little high, even though he was nothing like the depiction that we know and love. But we did get to see a little bit of Rich Boy Zemo in that series. And again, that elevated him a little bit more. And I loved his take of just like this snooty, rich dude that's condescending, but also kind of funny.
Who knows how to hit up the rave, who knows how to talk to the revolutionaries.
He knows how to get down. So I love that we got it. And he's, of all the villains on the list, I can't wait to see him again. Because he'll be back.
We'll get him again.
I can't wait.
Yeah. Someone we will not get back that I thought really thrived as a one-shot, and I would say this was like the most successful one-note villain. It wasn't super complex, but it was terrifying. It was great. It was Hela.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about Hela. She was just a force. She came on like a force and burned her way through that film. And we probably won't see her again, but yet she made it all the way up to 14. So how'd you get her up that high?
First of all, Hela was around the time that Marvel finally got it when it came to the villains. They knew how to give the villains personality. They were threatening. They were cool. She had the weird creating metal crap like Witchblade used to. Like it was cool. And I'll say this is my theory at the time. They switched Thanos' whole, stupid sad boy in love with death. I thought that they were going to make Hela the depiction of death, and he was going to be doing all this stuff in service to her. So that was kind of my theory going into it.
Interesting.
Of course, that didn't happen. What we got was cool, but that's kind of what I thought, since she was the whole goddess of death thing. But I love that, again, she was threatening. Nobody could take her down, and they didn't really beat her. They kind of was just like, we'll keep you in this pocket universe to fight this lava monster, and we won't have to deal with you anymore. She was just so powerful and had so much personality. Unfortunately, you're right. We probably won't see her again, but if we do, I'm cool. I'm down.
So I wanted two more quick villains, because I think they both kind of fall into gray area, at least in the comics. And how we talk about them in relationship to the shows is a little different. And then I want to step back a little bit and go big picture again. But Ronin and Elektra, very different shows, very different portrayals.
Very different.
Both, and again, maybe you already answered this in a way, because you said you tried to get away from the weighing the comic book roles.
Right.
But both far more complicated characters in the comics, far more nuanced roles in the way that they relate to the universe around them. Ronin, again, felt like kind of a throwaway. I didn't think he was bad or anything in the film, but using a character of that status and getting rid of him in that way felt like a real waste. What was your take on Ronin?
That was exactly my take. I agree with you. I think Ronin's cool, and I love his, he's another person that feels justified in what he does. And they touch on that a little bit. But again, it just felt like, Power Rangers, monster of the day. We're going to kill you and blow up and then move on to the next. And a lot of those early villains, unfortunately, because some of them are big villains and have great comic backstories, they kind of lost because other than standing and looking and posing and, I got the Power Stone, but then that's it. I don't even really do anything with it except snarl and growl. Unfortunately, we didn't get that nuance that was put there to it. They tried with Elektra, They
They
tried.
tried. So my thing with Elektra is, and I'll see if you agree on this, it was just a casting issue. I just
think
did not think that actress could hang with an actor of Charlie Cox's caliber. And so it just,
that had a little bit to do with it, but again, it was the way she was written. It was just she felt too much like Catwoman, if you feel what I'm saying. Like she was just like, oh, I'm gonna be sexy and the hero likes me, but I might do my own thing. Watch out. And it came off
which
a little
in fairness
too
is the plot, right? I mean, like if you're reductive about it, that is Elektra, but the idea is that she has to be a worthy equal and opposite of Daredevil and Matt Murdock to pull that off.
And that was not the case ever throughout it. And they brought her back as the zombie lady. And it's like they really wanted to do something and they just couldn't put the pieces together. And unfortunately, she was just an exercise in frustration to me. No offense to the actress, but it's just I did not like how she was written.
So anything when you did the list that surprised you about how high you had someone or how low you had someone?
Yes. The one that I got the most pushback on was my man Cottonmouth. And everybody loves him. Again, he's probably like my favorite villain. People say I am Cottonmouth. I even have the big Biggie poster in my office. If I was home instead of work, you would see that because there's a gigantic poster behind me. I love him, but people are like, oh, he's easily top 5. But he was taken out so soon of the series. He only made it like halfway through. So no, I couldn't put him up that high. And one person who was very high that I guess I kind of knew but surprised people was his counterpart, Mariah Dillard, Mariah Stokes. And she's another one. I know we talked about Killmonger. I know we talked about Kingpin. She has the most underrated arc of all of the Marvel Netflix villains because she goes from this reluctant kind of politician that's into doing shady stuff and she's got this crime family and she dips her toe in it and she kind of doesn't want to do it to like just straight up pyromaniac by the end of the movie, burning people, killing people. There was one episode where she was like wandering around with Luke Cage and she's just cracking jokes and being evil the whole time. It's hilarious.
I need to go back a little bit and check it out.
It was one of her last episodes. I'm picturing they're like walking through some warehouse or something. But her arc to me is one of the best arcs in the whole series. So she was much higher than I expected. And my boy Cottonmouth was a little lower than I thought.
I know. So we're going to wrap up pretty soon. I really appreciate your time. Tell me a villain or two that has yet to show up that you would be most excited to see how Marvel does.
Oh my goodness. My number one is my favorite villain of all time. I know we haven't gotten to them yet because they're X-Men. Nathaniel Exis. Give me Mr. Sinister. You've been playing with my emotions for how many years? Every series we'll see like, oh, Essex Orphanage or like there's a briefcase with Essex Corporation, but he never shows up. I want him to show up and be awesome. That is the one.
I totally agree. Do you have I have an actor in mind. Do you have an actor you'd love to see play him?
I have like 3 or 4 because I've thought about this way too much, but who is your person?
John Hamm.
Oh, that's a good one.
Because he could do that. He could do that sarcastic, casually funny, but he's really stabbing you. You know, that stuff. And he would have he can be. We've seen him in characters kind of switch the lever of being the good guy, the silly light front, and really like, the devil under it, which to me is a defining Sinister characteristic.
That is what I love the most, that chillingness, but also kind of that cool demeanor. And unfortunately, I'm blanking on the actor's name right now. My man who plays Gus in Breaking Bad.
Oh, yeah.
He's also in Mandalorian.
If you're still watching, you're gonna know what's his name.
I'm a terrible human being because I'm forgetting his name. Y'all know who I'm talking about.
Of course.
He would be incredible as well.
Something Esposito.
Yes, he would be incredible at that. So
Giancarlo.
Thank you. Giancarlo Esposito.
So make that happen. Make it. I don't care how many coins you have to throw that way. Make it happen.
I actually thought Giancarlo Esposito would be a great high evolutionary.
I've actually heard his name thrown around for that too. And again, that's another one that will work.
So good.
Yeah, I mean, he could be
for that one.
Doom. He could be a million people. He's just awesome.
Oh, that's interesting. He'd be an older Doom, but yeah, he's a great actor. I'm curious to see what kind of Galactus we get because it's at some point we will get Galactus.
And it's gonna happen. I know everyone's thinking that like this is like we built to Thanos, we're building to Galactus. My crazy theory is I think we're building the Secret Wars. And
we're definitely building Secret Wars. We'll do another. I'll have you back and we'll do like a Secret Wars one.
Yes. To me, I think happening.
It's without question. Yeah.
But I'm thinking Beyonder would be the guy. But beyond that, like Galactus is happening. It's gonna have to be something where it's like some awesome dude, but also have CGI. So I'm not sure who the heck would be him, but they'll make it work. Trust if they can make, Andy Serkis.
I love it.
Well,
what can't she do?
Listen, she could make it work. If they had Andy as a freaking monkey in Planet of the Apes, they can make anything work.
I know. Well, listen, I want to thank you for your time. This has been great. Tell us a little bit about your blog, where people can find it, what it's about. Tell us stuff.
Absolutely. soulandstereo.com. If you got digital internet hookup, you can find us anywhere. We do music reviews, album reviews, lots of pop culture talk, movie talk. As you see, my gigantic villains list, we do relationship advice. You can find it at soulandstereo.com. We're on YouTube now. So yes, Soul and Stereo Sessions on YouTube. And you can find me on Twitter at ET Bowser, on Facebook, the Soul and Stereo Cipher on Facebook, and Instagram at Edward Bowser.
And we'll make sure we get all that information in the show notes below once we get this after the live's over. Thank you, Edward. Thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it. Thanks, producer Dan, for connecting us. I really appreciate that as well. And remember, please hit the subscribe, smash the like button. It really helps us out as we grow the audience. Share it with anyone you know might be interested. And we will see you Thursday. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.